Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Sophia and I'm one of the training service leads at Buckinghamshire Mind. So really warm welcome to today's session, which is supporting someone's wellbeing, trauma awareness for sponsors. So over the next 90 minutes, and we may be quicker than that, we're going to explore the impact of trauma, some common reactions to trauma, and how we can effectively as hosts support someone and ultimately learn about where we need to go when someone needs some more support for their mental health. So the purpose of this workshop, it's to provide some space to explore some common questions that we might have or some common worries. And hopefully it's going to be a gentle reminder that you're not expected to be a mental health expert. This is all about signposting and directing someone. So, the reasons why someone might develop a mental health problem, they're complex. There isn't a blueprint, and that's similar to trauma. Individuals will have different reactions and process it differently. So there isn't one size fits all, which also means there's not a perfect way to support someone, but connection, empathy, kindness, listening and sharing our common humanity, they are all things we can do that can and will make a difference to the people that we're supporting. So that's the good news. So in terms of who we are, Buckinghamshire Mind is part of a network of local minds delivering mental health services in communities across England and Wales. So very much grassroots and led by the communities that we work in. We're independent, and although we're charities affiliated with National Mind, we provide services that are tailored to the needs of the specific community. So at Buckinghamshire Mind, these include services such as counselling, wellbeing groups, peer support, employment support, children, young people services, older adult services, crisis support and training. So we work in conjunction with National Mind, standing up for mental health. And all of those services mentioned are available to the Ukrainian refugees, any refugees that you are supporting. So in terms of today, these are the aims that we're going to be exploring. So understand what trauma is, common reactions, how to support someone experiencing trauma. We're going to do a whistle-stop tour of what PTSD is. We're going to also look at how we have a conversation around someone's mental health supportively, and that's a really key word there. We're also going to examine the importance of looking after our own mental well-being, which is just as integral as the people we're supporting. We're also going to give you some insight around what to do when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis, and also give you signposting to organisations, to people that can help support in that scenario. And ultimately, as I aforementioned, recognise that we don't need to be mental health experts, but we can and are having a really positive impact. And whilst this recording isn't interactive, there will be lots of areas where you can connect to other hosts that we'll mention later on in the workshop, that you'll be able to reflect with and hold space with as well. So I'd just like to direct your attention to this quote here. So the first thing to recognise is just how much of a key role you're already playing in supporting your guests' wellbeing, and by doing what you're doing, providing them with security and stability, in opening up your home and supporting them in the community. So the people that we're supporting may have experienced significant challenges and trauma, which may, in turn impact their mental health. But it's important to note that if this is the case, from a treatment point of view, therapeutic interventions wouldn't be effective until someone has basic security and stability, such as housing, healthcare, and education. So supporting people to feel safe, secure, and settled is playing a vital role in supporting their mental health. So this was a quote from one of our partners in Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, Dr. Eleanor Roswell. And she's a consultant clinical psychologist there, and she's reiterating that point, that you're already doing an awful lot to help support someone's mental health. So, as we've said, you don't need to be a mental health expert to make a difference to someone's mental health. That's the really good news. And quite often, supporting someone's mental well-being just looks like this.
I was on my sofa.
It was at his house.
It was after work.
I was in
the living room.
I just made 2 cups of tea.
Took my boots off, sat down.
I told one of my oldest friends.
I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to be talking about.
How will I, what words will I use and how will I say this?
Oh my goodness, what's going to be revealed here?
There's this stigma attached to not only mental health, but how we approach talking about mental health.
He sat and listened.
I saw his honesty as a strength.
I felt relieved. So relieved.
There's no grand statements or gestures. I send her a picture on Facebook and she knows then that I'm thinking of her.
There are some days when I wake up and I won't feel as sparkly as I usually feel, and without me even saying anything, he will bring me a cup of tea.
He's just the same person.
It's just normal. Whatever way you feel comfortable in whatever environment, just start that conversation.
Go for a walk with your mate. Go for a coffee.
Just the smallest thing can make the biggest difference.
Small things can make a big difference when it comes to mental health. Search Time to Change online to discover the small things you can do.
There we go. So just a gentle reminder that you're already doing an awful lot to help someone.
I was on my sofa.
Okay, so we're going to start off with a definition of mental health and mental well-being, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So in terms of your mental health, just like physical health, everybody has mental health. It's something we all have in common. It's as normal as elbows. We all have elbows, we all have mental health. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which we can cope with day-to-day life, work productively. And this doesn't necessarily mean working is something we do to earn money sense, but also hobbies, passions, life admin, etc. And that we're able to make a contribution to our community. So the way that Mind likes to discuss mental health is to think of it as more of a spectrum, that we have mental health, and mental health is a spectrum ranging from positive mental health, which means being generally able to think, feel and react in the ways that we need and want to live our life, to then mental health problems, to experiencing mental illness. So our mental health might fluctuate along the spectrum depending on who we are, our background, personality, our life experiences, resilience, and our current situation and environment. So some people live their lives with a long-term mental illness, just as people live their lives with a long-term physical illness. Other people recover from their mental illness after treatment, particularly if the cause was situational, such as a traumatic event. And part of our overall mental health is our mental well-being. So your mental well-being is your day-to-day emotional state, how we're feeling in any given moment and how well we're able to cope with day-to-day life. So our mental well-being, a good way to think of it is that it's dynamic. So we mean it's constantly changing, because we all experience periods of good and low mental well-being. That's life, isn't it? That's being human. So when we have good mental well-being, it doesn't mean that we're happy all the time. That's toxic positivity if we're trying to do that. But rather that we cope with daily stresses, that we feel engaged with the world around us, we experience positive relationships, and we feel like we have some control over our life and a sense of purpose. So sometimes our mental well-being is lower and the day-to-day becomes more difficult. That's when we might feel stressed or sad or unable to cope with things. So that's a little context around mental health and mental well-being overall and how those two interact. So we're going to explore what trauma is now and post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma is something that can have a really big impact on our mental well-being and our mental health, and sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're now going to look at these, but just a reminder that we're not expecting you to turn into clinicians or experts. The purpose of having this awareness isn't to diagnose or make any assumptions about someone's experience, but might make us as hosts feel more confident to support someone who is perhaps struggling from trauma-related experiences. So what is trauma? Well, the English Oxford Dictionary defines trauma as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, an emotional shock following a stressful event or physical injury. And if you're like me, you're a bit of a nerd and you like to know the origins of word, it's actually of Greek origin and comes from the word that literally means to wound. So There are lots of different types of trauma. Common traumas include experiencing accidents, disasters, being deliberately hurt by other people. But no matter what the type of trauma, it's typically characterized by the following things. So, one, it's an inescapable stressful event. Two, we are overwhelmed, our overwhelmed coping mechanisms kick in, and the individual. Three is rendered helpless. So not only are there different types of traumas, but also different ways in which they can be experienced. We might experience it firsthand, or we might have witnessed or heard about it, which would be what we call vicarious trauma. It might be a one-off event or repeated instances. What's really important to know is that trauma is an individual experience. What makes something traumatic for one person and not another depends on what's happened in their past, what is happening in their life now, and what the experience actually is. And that's a really good way of remembering that we're all individuals and it's going to affect us all slightly differently. So when it comes to our mental health, trauma puts us at risk in many different ways. It's important to note that none of these are guaranteed outcomes. These will depend on a complex layer of different things, such as your genetics, personality, your individual resilience, social, cultural, and economic factors. But the risk of experiencing these challenges is increased as a result of experiencing trauma. And you might notice in the bottom right-hand corner of this presentation that this is written by the Tavistock and Portman Trauma Centre, which is part of the NHS Foundation Trust. So this has been written and reviewed by clinicians, just to give you some background as to where the information is coming from. So in order to understand the impact of trauma on a person, it can actually be really helpful to look at the body's natural responses to the experience of threat. So sometimes referred to as flight or fight response, which you may feel quite familiar. So this is a built-in response that we all have. It allows us to survive when we're facing something that could be life-threatening. So when we experience something we perceive as a threat, our stress response system is activated, leading to a number of important chemicals being released. So the first ones are adrenaline and noradrenaline. So that's part of the sympathetic nervous system. And then the next is cortisol. So that's the stress hormones. So as you might know, adrenaline is what causes fight or flight response. It gets our body ready to either run away or fight. Something about that is it's impossible to do either of these things in that situation. Sorry, I'll say that again. If it's impossible to do either of these things, fight or flight, in that particular threat, then the third response is what we call freeze. So if fight and flight aren't available as options, freeze may be what happens. So what happens around that time, the rest of your body that is kind of non-essential, so your digestion, for instance, will shut down. And blood will flow to your muscles and joints. So that can be a reason why sometimes your hands get really, really sweaty. It would be in case you needed to fight or to grab something, just as a little side note there. So let's look at how trauma changes their physiology. This is what happens in our body when these systems come into play. The flight or fight response prepares us for immediate action. So it helps to shut down any body functions that are not necessary, such as your digestion system, and helps to give immediate requirements and extra helps to those functions we do need. So like I said, our muscles, our joints. And it can be really scary to experience these things. We might think that something is physically wrong, such as experiencing like a heart attack. But this is the body's natural reaction to threat. And if the danger passes, all of this will usually settle over about 20 to 30 minutes, that kind of time frame. Okay, so what happens after trauma? So the fight or flight response is the body doing what it needs to do to keep us safe in that moment. But in this state, our memories get stored differently. So this is in part due to the impact of cortisol. If you remember, that's the stress response hormone. And cortisol has an interesting effect on the brain. So normally, if you think of it in this way, our memories are stored like a filing cabinet. So if I was planning to go on a picnic tomorrow, for instance, it might make me think about the picnics I've been to in the past. I could go into my filing cabinet and go to the folder called picnics. There would probably be quite a few picnics in there. I could take one out and remember who I went with, where we went, and what the day was like. I could even then stop thinking about picnics and close the cabinet. So this kind of memory being formed involves many different parts of the brain, including parts that help us put the memory into context and give it a timeline. Now, traumatic memories might be more easily compared to a conveyor belt. So imagine the luggage conveyor belt at an airport. A trigger, something that is linked to the event or is a reminder of what happened, pushes you onto the conveyor belt. Once you're on it, the conveyor belt is the traumatic experience happening all over again. It's not that you're imagining it, you're back in it, and you can only get off when you've gone around to a point where it's possible to fall off and stop reliving the experience. So with the conveyor belt kind of memory, traumatic memory, it's always happening in the present. There's no sense of time or context and no way to be able to think about it without the risk of reliving it. So it's very common to experience memories like this following a traumatic experience. And typically other things that can happen after trauma include being on hyper alert in the first few hours or days. So this leads to strong feelings of being anxious and unsettled or maybe irritable and wound up. Anything outside the ordinary will initiate the fight or flight or freeze response again, so people can be triggered quite easily. And all of these things might lead to them potentially avoiding anything that could make them feel worse, reminders of the events, getting upset or even having contact with certain people. And it's quite common that they may feel quite low in mood or find themselves preoccupied with feelings they should have done more to help others, that hindsight. Okay. So in terms of early reactions to trauma, it's common and normal to be experiencing these things, everything from tearfulness to feeling guilty or somehow to blame. And I really want to highlight the word there, normal. These are really, really normal reactions to an extraordinary event. We will all possibly go through this if we were in the same situation. So flashbacks are conveyor belt memories. So these kinds of experiences are usually triggered by cues related to the five senses, particularly smell. Smell is particularly powerful as a trigger because the smell center in the brain is located very close to the memory center. So without even being aware of it, one of these sensory experiences may trigger a flashback, pushing someone onto that conveyor belt. So they are then reliving the event. So an example of this might be someone who sees a terrible car accident, who is then triggered every time they hear a screech or smell burning rubber, for instance. So just to be really, really clear, what's really important to be aware of is that these are ordinary reactions to an extraordinary event, and most people will have some of these reactions, if not all. It can be really very helpful to let someone who is going through this know that it is okay. It is part of how most people respond to trauma, and it is very likely to settle over time. So that's a really key thing to remember. Okay, we're going to explore now the different journeys after a traumatic event, because as we've said previously, we're all different and everybody might have a slightly different experience or processing period than the next. So this diagram helps us think about those different journeys that people may take after a traumatic event over a period of time. So we know that the early responses are experienced by most people, and if we look at the resilience and the recovery journeys, these responses settle over time. So this is really important when we think about helping people in the first few weeks after a traumatic event. With the right conditions, most people will find that things settle. So that's some really good news. Then if we look at the chronic journey, journey shows that for some people, things don't settle. So if this is true a month after the event, then these are the people who may be given a diagnosis of PTSD. There is another group. Some people may find that everything settles down for a while, then months or even sometimes even years later, they develop all the symptoms again. And this is what we would call delayed onset PTSD. It can often occur after another trauma, a bereavement, or sometimes more everyday events that cause change or upheaval. So, changing jobs or moving house, that kind of upheaval. So let's now look at PTSD, then the psychiatric definition. We're going to take a quick look at what psychiatrists mean when they diagnose someone with PTSD. But remember the quote from Dr. Roswell at the beginning of the session. if someone has experienced PTSD, therapeutic interventions won't be effective until they are settled and have their basic needs met. But again, this awareness is designed to make us feel more confident in when to direct somebody to support and what their experience might look like. So when it comes to diagnosing PTSD, psychiatrists take a history of what has happened and what people may be struggling with. They may, for instance, ask someone to fill in some questionnaires, then they use a classification system that describes what symptoms are needed to make the diagnosis. So for PTSD, they'll want the individual to describe more about the trauma, which could have been experienced in different ways. It may have been something that directly happened to that person, or they may have witnessed it happening to someone else. They may have learnt about a terrible event, such as murder, or there may be repeated exposure to the details of trauma that has occurred to others. So the requirement for a PTSD diagnosis are first that the symptoms that we explored earlier have been present for more than 1 month. And remember, most people will have some or even many of the symptoms early on. That's really normal. We usually settle if they are on the resilience or the recovery journeys. After 1 month, this is less likely. So the symptoms also need to be causing significant distress or interfering with the person's usual way of functioning in the world. And the definition, it divides the symptoms into 4 broad categories, which we already know about. So there's re-experiencing. So these are symptoms related to reliving the traumatic event, and they could include flashbacks, distressing dreams or nightmares, acting or feeling as if events are reoccurring, and intense physical distress and reactivity. The next is avoidance. So avoiding anything that might remind them of the trauma, or avoidance of distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, maybe even avoiding people. The third is increased arousal. So what we mean by that is people struggling to sleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, aggressive, reckless or self-destructive behaviour, maybe difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response as well. So getting really easily spooked. And then the last area is negative thoughts and mood. So self-blame, feeling separate or different from others, much less interest in usual activities, psychological amnesia, for instance. I think it's important to note at this point as well that we may have some expectations, even if we're not aware of them, that we feel that people should be grateful that they've got this opportunity of being with us and safe. And it's a gentle reminder that people have been through a lot, the people that we're supporting, and whilst they are probably very grateful, it may not be displayed in a way that seems obvious to us, and to just be gentle around that and not have too many high expectations. So yeah, really important to think about how someone's negative thoughts and mood might affect their behaviour. So that's just something to note. So as we've said, the majority of people will be on the resilience and recovery journey and experience short-term distress. Only a minority will go on to develop PTSD, and this will be really influenced by a complex layer of other risk factors, such as family history of mental health illness and experiencing perhaps previous trauma. And so there are protective measures that the individuals can put in place, and we can absolutely support them to put in place to reduce the risk of developing PTSD, which we will talk about in a moment. So that's another little bit of good news, that generally speaking, most people won't develop PTSD. Okay, because most people will be on the resilience and recovery journeys where they recover without the need for treatment, the early response to trauma is something called watchful waiting. So watchful waiting is the term used in official government guidelines. That's NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, for treating people with trauma-related problems. So it is a term that emphasises that often the best thing to do is to carefully wait and see how people are progressing on their own journey towards recovery. And perhaps that feels a bit odd to not actually actively need to do anything, but to just wait. But watchful waiting, it includes helping people understand that this is a normal response. They may not need anything specific to be done, but there are things that they can do to help themselves. So at the top of the list is looking after themselves and then using their social network support. Really, really key. So what we know is a strong social support network is a significant protective factor. And when we say protective factor, what we mean by that is something that's going to really help that person's resilience and help look after them. So we might want to encourage or support our guests to build this network as they're getting settled. So are there any community groups? Are there any Facebook groups? Are there any Ukrainian community centres near that we can signpost them to? Because that's going to be a significantly protective factor for helping them process the trauma that they've been through. So in terms of thinking about what we can do, with the advice and support we might give to individuals in the early response stage, that can include reassurance that what they're experiencing is normal, it's understandable, and will usually reduce over time. Trying to remember to take each day at a time. Let's not expect too much. As we've said, make use of the supports around. So maybe for them, maintaining contact with family and friends, or social or work groups is really, really important. You may find it helpful to seek other support, such as voluntary agencies, including the Samaritans, for instance, or to perhaps express their reactions in a way that feels comfortable for them. So this links to research that was done on some kinds of psychological debriefing, where people were encouraged to talk about what had happened very soon after. And what they found was that for some people, this actually added significantly to the trauma, as they weren't ready to talk. Perhaps because they did not feel safe enough yet, or they still felt too overwhelmed. So the general recommendation now is that this kind of debriefing should not be done, which is exactly why therapeutic interventions, they won't be offered at this stage. It's much later on down the line, because it can potentially cause harm. So instead, it is really important that someone who is being traumatized listens to themselves and does what feels best for them. So this means talking only when they're ready. And we've had some feedback from earlier sessions that there is a challenge around language barriers. So at the end of this workshop, I'm going to signpost you to some online resources that have translated worksheets on trauma and where to get help and advice around Buckinghamshire and Berkshire. And that's in Ukrainian, Polish and Russian as well. So just to reassure you that we do have some resources that have been translated. So here's how we can best help as sponsors and hosts. Watchful waiting really is the best idea. You don't need to do or fix anything. This is about helping that traumatized person in their own recovery. So allow the survivor the space to talk if they wish to do so, but do not push them to talk before they're ready. Be aware they may initially be irritable, angry, flat, lacking in concentration, or hyper alert, or perhaps in your perception come across as not very grateful. Again, it's about really giving that person space and being patient and understanding, very important. So where possible, encourage the survivor to look after their physical health and keep to their usual routines as much as possible, and be available in a non-judgmental, open manner. Let them know that this will improve with time. So other things to consider, respect their personal space, look out for warning signs, which we'll explore a little bit later on. Really key, help them find support and encourage that they build their own social network. And really, really important, look after your own mental well-being. It's a big thing to open your home up to a stranger, and it's important to recognise that that will have some toll on you. So being aware, being self-aware of what you need to stay mentally and physically well is really important, so you're not pouring from an empty cup, as the saying goes. So what to look out for? If any of these factors are present in someone who has experienced trauma, professional help should be sought even in those early stages. So when we talk about severe symptoms, what we mean by that is they last longer than 1 month. So that's really, really key, the time frame. Other things such as previous or existing mental health problems. So if someone is already depressed or anxious or has another mental health illness, and their capacity to manage a traumatic event is going to be impaired. So that's something to look out for. Persistent suicidal thoughts. We will look at this in more detail later. But again, that's a sign that appropriate clinical help should be sought as soon as possible. Many people with trauma symptoms may turn to alcohol or other drugs as a way of numbing, of switching off what they're feeling. It's understandable, but it does put them more at risk of developing problems later on, including addiction. So that is something to bear in mind. And lastly, if they ask for help, obviously it goes without saying, if the person is aware that these responses are normal and like this is settled with time, and yet still feel they need help, then that feeling should be taken seriously. That's really important. Okay, so that was our trauma section. Now we're going to think about supporting someone with their mental health more generally. And this is a moment to, this is a moment to stress. We are not suggesting that we should be clinicians or able to diagnose problems. However, knowing that someone might be struggling with their mental health might help us to be able to signpost someone to support at an earlier stage. And remember, it's not down to us to fix anything. The most important thing that we can do is signpost someone to professional help. And the earlier we can do this, obviously, the quicker somebody gets access to support, the better all around. So if someone is experiencing poor mental health, what might some of the physical signs be? What are the psychological or emotional signs? And what are the behavioural signs? So in terms of what you might see, it could be anything from fatigue, indigestion, headaches, appetite and weight changes, joint and back pain, changes in sleep pattern. You could be seeing visible tension or trembling, nervous trembling speech, chest or throat pain, sweating, or constantly feeling cold. In terms of psychological symptoms, it could be anything, a few of these on this list. So everything from anxiety or distress, mood changes, difficulty relaxing, lapses in memory, increased suicidal thoughts. They may be responding to experiences, sensations, or people not observable by others, or illogical or irrational thought processes. So these are some of the things you might see as outward signs. And then lastly, behavioural symptoms. So again, these are things around increased smoking and drinking, using recreational drugs, withdrawal, maybe a resigned attitude. You could be seeing things like overexcitement or euphoria, repetitive speech or activity, uncharacteristic errors, maybe apparent overreaction to problems or risk-taking, or maybe disruptive or antisocial behaviour. So in terms of helpful approaches for supporting others, here are a few key tips just to help remind you with. So ask how you can help. The expert in this moment is the person that's experiencing the trauma, the negative feelings. So they might already have an idea of what they know is going to help them. So ask the question, how can you help? Be open-minded. It's really important to approach this with a non-judgmental attitude, and not try to feel a response with judgment or you need to do this. Just try to be open-minded. It might help to not just talk about mental health. We're very good at talking about the weather in the UK, aren't we? But yeah, try to also have just casual conversations, normal conversations, anything about, hobbies or what's going on. So that can be really useful. It's really important to show trust and respect, and goes without saying, if they disclose something that is a safeguarding concern, you're worried about them, then just keep the lines of communication open, explain or discuss the next steps, or if you're going to reach out for support, so they're included in that open dialogue. And last but not least, really, really important to look after yourself. You have to be a factor in all of this, your mental well-being and mental health. So I've got a little video for you now. When it comes to supporting others, the key thing we do is listen and show empathy. So this is a video by Brené Brown, who is an American researcher and storyteller. And in this video, she explains the difference between empathy and sympathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so getting towards the end of the workshop now, we're going to explore what we do in what we call a mental health crisis. So sometimes someone might need emergency support for their mental health. So I'm going to walk you through what to do if someone is experiencing a mental health crisis. So what is a mental health crisis? It's basically when somebody's mental health is at breaking point. And it can manifest in lots of different ways, but they might be experiencing thoughts of suicide or self-harming behaviour, perhaps extreme anxiety or panic attacks, psychotic episodes, anything from delusions, hallucinations, or hearing voices, hypomania or mania. So that's like periods of overreactive or active behaviour. Or perhaps you might be seeing other behaviour that feels out of control or likely to endanger themselves or others. And it can feel very distressing to witness somebody going through this, but we're going to walk you through what you could do in that situation that's going to help de-escalate and ultimately keep you and that person safe. So it's 2 steps, as simple as that. In these instances, the first thing to do is check the physical safety of you and the individual. Are they safe and are you safe? Are they in immediate danger? If you or they aren't safe, call 999 for an ambulance or go straight to A&E. Our nearest A&E in Bucks is at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, which obviously will be slightly different depending on where you are in terms of area. So if you're both safe, we've got some different options that we can include. So you can help the individual to call their GP to get an emergency. And we know from a Bucks and Berkshire perspective that across the entire NHS, they have been briefed about Ukrainian refugees in particular at the moment. So they don't necessarily need to be registered with a GP. They've bypassed that in order for them to access support. So that's a really good bit of news, because I can appreciate sometimes it can take a long time to register someone to the GP. The other option is contacting the NHS 111 for quick medical advice, and sometimes 111 often actually they can be very good at getting an emergency appointment at a doctor's. So that is definitely worth exploring. You could also encourage them to call a 24/7 support line, such as Samaritans or Shout. So that's a free 24/7 text messaging service for times when people feel they need immediate support. We are currently talking to the Samaritans because they don't have translators there, but you could be potentially helping at the end of the line with that person supporting them to make that call. And we are looking into what other translation services are available that you could use in conjunction to that. So just to be mindful of that. And also you can help them to contact their local mind or other local organisations that can help. So that would be, for instance, like we said, us, it could be Healthy Minds, and we're going to explore some of those other areas of support shortly. So we help you to understand where to go for help in the local community, but most importantly, to feel safer and create safety plans if you're struggling to keep yourself safe due to thoughts of self-harm or ending your life. So this is all about our service, Books Minds Safe Haven. So the way to think of it, it's like A&E for mental health. It's crisis support for anyone living in Bucks aged 18 or over. That's really, really key, because for children it's slightly different. They go via CAMHS. The Children and Young People's Mental Health Service via the NHS. So Safe Haven is open 7 days a week, 6 p.m. till midnight. They provide listening and signposting, and that can be both in face-to-face groups with the option of a one-to-one discussion. It can be a 30-minute phone or video support call. And ultimately what happens is a person accessing that service will create a safety plan with a support worker, a trained support worker, and ensure that they have the links into the community to help them feel supported and connected. So you can see on the right-hand side there's the Safe Haven leaflet, and you can see we've got a site in Aylesbury with slightly different opening times, and then High Wycombe, which is open 7 nights a week as well, and that's the details for that also. Okay, so that's another avenue of support. There's also lots of external sources of support. So as we've said already, GP, the NHS, Samaritans, Healthy Mind Books. These are actually hyperlinks, so you can click onto them and be taken directly to the site. There should be a PDF of this workshop as well, where you'll be able to click on those links. So that should be there alongside this recording. Okay. And then let's just quickly go to looking after our own mental well-being. Now, this is at the end of the session, but it's not because it's an afterthought. It's because we want you to leave with this on your mind. Looking after your own well-being is just as important as looking after other people's. So the first thing that we want to highlight is something called compassion fatigue. You are wonderful, caring, supportive people, and wonderful, caring, supportive people often find it hard to put themselves first. But what compassion fatigue tells us is that if we don't look after ourselves, we run the risk of not being able to look after others. So it's actually a priority. And you may have heard of the oxygen mask analogy. You know, if you've taken a flight before, you would have heard the safety instructions that you should fit your own oxygen mask before helping others. Really, really important. And it's a well-worn cliched saying, but it's true in life as well. In order to help others, we must first look after ourselves. There is nothing self-indulgent or selfish about looking after your well-being. It's vital, and it helps us to do everything that you want to do. Okay. So in terms of looking after ourselves, build a support network. Really important to have boundaries. So what I mean by that is maybe there's a room in your house that is kind of off limits, and that's just where you can kind of decompress a little bit and get some space. Maybe there's a few evenings in the week or a day in the weekend where you go off and do something just with your family or just you, like making time for hobbies. Having those kind of boundaries is really important. Make sure you have someone to talk to. It can be really helpful if you have attended these trauma sessions to connect to the people that were also on the workshop who are going through what you're going through. Look after your well-being. So that's all the stuff we know we need to do. Eating well, nutritious, wholesome foods, getting our exercise in, having time to do the hobbies and things that we enjoy, as well as giving yourself some time to rest and being kind to yourself. I always think to treat your self-care not as some kind of reaction to a stressful week, but as an integral part of your routine, such as brushing your teeth. That's how important and necessary and daily it should be. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the workshop. Just to highlight some extra areas of support. So at Mind, there's always someone to turn to. National Mind have an info line, which is open between those days and those times. That's the number there. And you can ask any kind of question you might have around mental health, and they'll be on hand and can provide legal advice as well. So really great resource there. In terms of Buckinghamshire Mind, if you need any help or support, here's our details. If you have any specific questions around this training, it's training@booksmind.org.uk, or if you would like to be emailed a copy, like a PDF of this workshop, then that's who to contact, training@booksmind.org.uk. In terms of specific support for being a sponsor, these are some absolutely great resources to explore. Community Impact Books, that has resources both for you guys as sponsors and also some translated areas on their website for Ukrainian refugees with advice and support there. There's also a comprehensive toolkit from Reset. So Reset is the official partner of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And they've created a toolkit for you guys with lots of really useful guidance on aspects such as thinking about the power balance, building relationships, integration support, and preparing your property. And then Buckinghamshire Council also have a really great community support page for Ukrainian refugees in Buckinghamshire and for you guys as well, and have everything from guides in Ukrainian, Polish, Russian to help people integrate into the NHS service, what to expect in books, where to get help for different aspects of living in the county. So really, really useful. And that brings us to the end of our workshop. So thank you so much for attending. As I aforementioned, if you have any questions, concerns, or would like to know a little bit more about where to get support, then please drop us a line at training@booksmind.org.uk. Best of luck with everything. We are here if you need, and very, very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.